My family cut me off from my inheritance at my father's funeral, saying I was a disappointment who didn't deserve the family fortune. They didn't know that while they were dividing up his $50 million estate, I had already built a business empire worth 10 times that amount. When my brother's billionaire boss walked into our lawyer's office 6 months later and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, meet the majority shareholder of my company, Sarah's sister Jennifer," my mother's face went ashen. The family failure they'd disinherited now owned 60% of the tech giant where my brother worked, and his next promotion was literally in my hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known something was wrong when my mother, Patricia Mitchell, greeted me at the funeral home wearing her lawyer's expression, the same cold, calculating look she'd worn during her most ruthless corporate mergers. I'd just flown in from Silicon Valley, where I'd been in back-to-back board meetings for the past 3 days, my black suit still wrinkled from the red-eye flight. It was my father's funeral, and I'd hoped that maybe, in our shared grief, my family might finally see past their rigid expectations to understand what I'd been building. But let me tell you how a family can destroy you on the worst day of your life, how they can use your moment of vulnerability to cut you down completely, only to discover that while they were fighting over scraps, you had already built an empire that dwarfed everything they thought they knew about wealth and power. This is the story of how I went from being the disinherited daughter to secretly controlling the very company that employed my golden boy brother, and how sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up working for you. The Mitchell family had built their fortune on 4 generations of traditional East Coast business success. My grandfather had been a steel magnate who'd built factories across Pennsylvania, accumulating wealth through industrial dominance. My father had modernized the family approach, transitioning into commercial real estate and investment banking, growing our family's net worth to over $50 million through strategic acquisitions and careful portfolio management. My older brother Daniel had followed the established path perfectly. Harvard MBA, Goldman Sachs analyst, then senior vice president at Novatech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. I was supposed to be next in line, the daughter who would help preserve and grow the Mitchell legacy through traditional business channels. Instead, I'd chosen what they saw as professional rebellion. While Daniel was climbing corporate ladders and networking at exclusive clubs, I was starting tech companies from my garage and reinvesting every profit into new ventures. While he was building his resume with prestigious firms, I was building actual businesses that generated real value and sustainable growth. But today felt different. Today, I was returning home with knowledge that would change everything. Over the past 15 years, I had quietly built a portfolio of technology investments that had generated returns beyond anyone's imagination. My venture capital firm, operating under a corporate structure that kept my identity private, had been the primary investor in dozens of successful startups. More importantly, I'd been accumulating significant ownership stakes in established companies, including a controlling 60% share in Novatech Solutions, the very company where Daniel worked as a senior executive. The irony wasn't lost on me that my brother, their pride and joy, was essentially working for me without knowing it. But I hadn't come home to reveal corporate secrets. I'd come to bury my father and hopefully find some peace with the family that had never understood my unconventional path to success. The funeral home reflected the Mitchell family's commitment to appearances, elegant flowers, expensive caskets, and an atmosphere of dignified wealth. Through the viewing room windows, I could see the familiar crowd, corporate executives, investment bankers, and old money families who measured success by social status and inherited fortune. This was the world I'd grown up in, but never quite belonged to, preferring innovation to tradition. My mother had made her disapproval clear from the beginning. "Jennifer, you're wasting your intelligence on these risky ventures," she'd said when I started my first company at 25. The Mitchell family builds lasting wealth through proven strategies, not by chasing technology fads that could disappear overnight. My father had been more supportive, but still concerned. "Sweetheart, entrepreneurship is fine as a hobby, but you need to think about building something permanent, something that will benefit the family for generations." Daniel had been the most condescending. "Jen, you're playing startup games while I'm building real corporate value," he'd said during our last family gathering. "When you're ready to be serious about business, I can probably get you an interview at Novatech. We're always looking for smart analysts." But standing in that funeral home, Wearing my simple black suit and carrying the weight of my father's death, I knew something they didn't. I hadn't been playing games. I'd been building the future. Daniel intercepted me before I could reach the family gathering room, his face set in the same stern expression our father had worn when delivering business ultimatums. He looked impeccable in his custom-tailored black suit, every inch the successful corporate executive. But his eyes held something that made my stomach drop, the look of someone who'd been planning this conversation for weeks. "Jennifer, we need to talk before you go in there," he said, steering me toward a private consultation room away from the other mourners. "The family has made some difficult decisions about Dad's estate." "Decisions?" I kept my voice steady despite the warning bells going off in my head. "What kind of decisions?" He pulled out a thick legal folder and set it on the mahogany table between us. "Look, Jen, Dad's will was written 5 years ago, before we fully understood the extent of your lifestyle choices. The family has decided to contest certain provisions to better reflect his actual intentions." I stared at him, my mouth going dry. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" "Dad's intentions about what?" "About rewarding family members who've contributed to the Mitchell legacy," he said, his voice growing colder. "Dad always intended his wealth to go to people who would preserve and grow the family's reputation, not to those who've chosen to pursue experimental ventures that reflect poorly on our name." My mother appeared in the doorway, flanked by our family attorney, James Morrison. Patricia Mitchell looked regal in her designer black dress, every inch the grieving widow who was also a formidable businesswoman. Behind them, I could see several of my aunts and uncles, their faces a mixture of sympathy and resolution. "Jennifer, sweetheart, please sit down," my mother said, though her tone was anything but warm. "We need to discuss some changes to your father's estate planning." "What changes?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand what was happening. "Your father's will originally allocated 25% of his estate to you," James Morrison explained, opening his briefcase. "However, the family has decided to invoke the character clause that allows for reallocation of inheritance based on behavior that conflicts with family values." The accusations came systematic and rehearsed. Daniel led the charge, pulling out what looked like a prepared presentation. "Over the past 15 years, you've consistently made choices that embarrass the Mitchell family name. Failed startup ventures, risky investments, an unstable career path that reflects poorly on Dad's business acumen." "Failed ventures?" I said, my voice starting to crack. "Daniel, my companies have been unsuccessful," my mother interrupted. "Jennifer, we've done our research. Multiple business failures. Constantly moving between different projects. No steady income or proven track record. That's not what the Mitchell family represents." My Uncle Robert stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in corporate law. "Your cousins Margaret and David have built solid careers in traditional industries. They've married well, established themselves in respectable social circles, and maintained the family's reputation. Your entrepreneurial experiments have done the opposite." "We're not punishing you," my mother continued, her eyes filled with what she probably thought was compassion. "We're protecting the family legacy. Your father worked too hard building our wealth to see it squandered on ventures that have no proven success." James Morrison slid a new document across the table. "The revised inheritance allocates your original 25% among Daniel and your cousins, who have demonstrated fiscal responsibility and family loyalty. You'll receive a nominal amount, $100,000, which we feel is generous given the circumstances." The room fell silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Around me, the family that had raised me was systematically cutting me out of my inheritance, treating me like a financial liability that needed to be contained. "We're doing this because we love you," Daniel said with practiced sincerity. "But we can't enable your destructive relationship with money and business. Maybe this will finally motivate you to build something stable and respectable." I sat there, holding the legal documents that reduced my birthright to a rounding error, feeling like a stranger at my own father's funeral, the daughter they saw as a failure, while they had no idea I could buy their entire inheritance portfolio without thinking twice. By the end of the week, the story had spread through Philadelphia's business and social elite like wildfire. Someone had leaked details of the inheritance dispute to the Philadelphia Business Journal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And the headline made my stomach drop. Mitchell family disinherits daughter over failed business ventures. The article painted me as the black sheep who had squandered opportunities and embarrassed a distinguished family through poor financial decisions. My phone buzzed constantly with messages I couldn't bear to read. Former classmates from Penn, business contacts, family friends, all reaching out with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Saw the article about your family situation. Are you doing okay financially? Maybe this is a fresh start to focus on more stable career options? If you need help getting back on your feet, let me know. Each notification felt like another confirmation that everyone saw me as a failure who'd been rightfully cut off from family support. The professional humiliation was devastating. Word spread through Silicon Valley and East Coast investment circles that Jennifer Mitchell had been disinherited for failed entrepreneurship and financial irresponsibility. Venture capital firms that had previously respected my investment acumen suddenly started treating me differently, as if family rejection somehow indicated professional incompetence. Marcus Chen, a tech entrepreneur I'd known for years, called with obvious confusion. Jennifer, I heard about the inheritance situation. I'm sorry your family doesn't understand the startup world. If you need investment backing for your next venture, I know some angels who might be interested in smaller rounds. Before I could explain, he continued. Look, not every startup succeeds, and maybe it's time to consider joining an established company. I have connections at several firms that are always looking for experienced operators, even if your track record is mixed. The message was clear. My family's narrative had convinced everyone that my entrepreneurial career was a series of failures that justified being disinherited. Industry publications that had previously covered my investment successes suddenly stopped returning my calls. TechCrunch, which had once featured my companies in their startup coverage, began referring to me in articles as former entrepreneur Jennifer Mitchell, who was recently disinherited by her family due to business failures. The narrative was becoming accepted fact, despite having no connection to reality. The cruelest blow came when 3 of my portfolio companies' CEOs reached out with concern about my financial stability. They'd heard about the inheritance dispute and were worried about whether I could continue providing strategic guidance if I was struggling financially due to family cutoff. Sarah Rodriguez, CEO of a company where I held a 40% stake, actually offered to buy out my shares at a discount to help with your transition period. She had no idea she was essentially offering to purchase back my own investment at a fraction of its value because she believed I was desperate for cash. Boston Business Magazine ran a feature on when family money and business don't mix, using my situation as a cautionary tale about entrepreneurs who alienate their families through risky ventures. The article suggested that family disinheritance often indicated poor judgment and financial management skills that should concern potential business partners. Local startup accelerators where I'd previously been invited as a mentor quietly withdrew their invitations. Industry conferences stopped, including me in speaker lineups. My professional reputation was being destroyed by a family narrative that had no basis in my actual business performance or financial situation. The Philadelphia Country Club, where my family had been members for 3 generations, began treating me differently. Staff who had once been respectful became awkwardly sympathetic, offering condolences for my difficult family situation and asking if I was managing okay financially. I spent sleepless nights in my Palo Alto home, staring at portfolio statements showing hundreds of millions in assets, wondering how something so successful could be perceived as complete failure. My family had convinced an entire community that I was a financial disaster, and no amount of actual evidence seemed capable of changing that perception. The woman who secretly controlled some of the most valuable companies in Silicon Valley was being treated like someone who couldn't afford rent. For weeks after the inheritance debacle, I tried everything I could think of to correct my family's narrative, without revealing the full scope of my business empire. I sent them copies of industry publications that featured my companies, hoping concrete evidence of success might change their minds. I forwarded articles from Forbes and TechCrunch that highlighted my investment strategies and portfolio growth, thinking professional recognition might finally make them understand my achievements. Every effort was met with patronizing dismissal or outright ridicule. My mother reviewed my press clippings with the attention of someone humoring a delusional child. "Jennifer, these articles are very flattering, and I'm sure being mentioned in business magazines feels validating. But sweetheart, we need to focus on reality. Press coverage doesn't pay bills or build lasting wealth. Your father left a $50 million estate through proven business principles, not media attention." I tried reaching out to business colleagues who knew both my professional work and my family's social circle, hoping they might help bridge the gap between perception and reality. Robert Sterling, a private equity executive who had worked on deals with my family's investment firm, agreed to speak with my mother about my business acumen. The conversation backfired spectacularly. Robert later told me that my mother had listened politely, then responded, "Robert, I appreciate Jennifer's creativity and energy, but you have to understand our position. We've watched her jump from venture to venture for 15 years without building anything permanent. Daniel has a corner office at Novatech and a clear path to executive leadership. That's the kind of stability the Mitchell family respects." I decided to invite my family to visit my offices in Palo Alto, thinking that seeing my workspace and meeting my team might help them understand that I wasn't just playing entrepreneur. Daniel agreed to tour the facility, but only after I explained that several Fortune 500 companies had strategic partnerships with firms in my building. He spent 2 hours meeting my investment team, reviewing portfolio companies, and observing board meeting preparations. Afterward, his assessment was devastating. "Jen, this is impressive for a startup environment, but you're essentially managing other people's money and calling it your own business. When you're ready to build something substantial that creates actual value, rather than just shuffling investments around, let me know." My most desperate attempt came when I tried to hint at my ownership stakes in major companies without revealing specific details. I mentioned that my investment returns had been substantial, and that I had significant influence in several technology firms. I hoped they might ask follow-up questions that would allow me to share more information. Instead, their response was to become more concerned about my supposed delusions of grandeur. "Jennifer, confidence is wonderful, but there's a difference between optimism and fantasy," my Uncle Robert said during a tense family dinner. "We can all see your lifestyle and financial situation. Claiming to have major influence in technology companies when you're living like a struggling entrepreneur isn't healthy." The professional community's reaction was equally frustrating. Industry colleagues who had previously sought my investment advice started offering me entry-level positions at their companies. "Jennifer, if the family inheritance situation has put you in a tough spot financially, we have an opening for a business development associate. It's not executive level, but it's steady work with good benefits," one former collaborator suggested. I began second-guessing every business decision I'd made over the past 15 years. Late nights in my home office, surrounded by corporate documents and investment statements, I wondered if my family was right about my approach to wealth building. Maybe accumulating ownership stakes in private companies was somehow less legitimate than traditional corporate employment. The doubt crept in slowly, but persistently. When portfolio companies reported strong earnings, I questioned whether my contributions had been meaningful. When investment valuations increased, I wondered if I was just lucky rather than skilled. When board members praised my strategic thinking, I second-guessed whether they were just being polite to a major shareholder. By spring, I had almost convinced myself that my family's assessment was correct. I was playing at being a successful investor while building nothing of real substance. The breakthrough came on a sunny April morning when I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office. There was a knock at my door, and I opened it to find a young man I didn't immediately recognize, holding a bottle of champagne and looking both nervous and ecstatic. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm David Kim, CTO at CloudSync Technologies. I don't know if you remember me personally, but you changed my entire life's trajectory, and I needed to thank you in person." I invited him in, curious about what had brought him to my doorstep. He looked around at my modest home office with an expression of surprise, as if he'd expected something very different from someone he clearly held in high regard. "Please, sit down and tell me what this is about." 3 years ago, my startup was about to fold, he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. We had revolutionary cloud security technology, but we were completely out of funding. Every VC firm had turned us down, saying our market approach was too risky and our team was too inexperienced. I listened, trying to place his company among the dozens of investment decisions I had made over the years. You were the only investor who saw our potential. Your $2 million seed investment didn't just save our company. You personally mentored me through scaling challenges and connected us with enterprise clients who became our foundation customers. The memories started coming back. CloudSync had been a scrappy team with brilliant technology but no business experience. I'd seen potential where others saw only risk, providing not just capital but strategic guidance that helped them navigate early growth challenges. Your investment framework changed everything, he continued, pulling out his phone to show me recent headlines. We just closed our Series C at a $1.2 billion valuation. Your original $2 million stake is now worth over $200 million. But more importantly, you created 300 high-paying tech jobs and built a company that's protecting millions of users' data worldwide. I stared at the headlines, stunned by the magnitude of success I'd helped create, but hadn't fully appreciated. CloudSync had become one of the most valuable cybersecurity companies in Silicon Valley. That's not all, David continued, his excitement building. Your investment methodology has become legendary in the startup world. Other VCs are trying to replicate what they call the Mitchell model, finding exceptional teams with transformative technology and providing intensive strategic support, not just capital. He pulled out more documents, case studies, academic papers, and industry reports. Business schools are teaching your investment approach as a case study in value-added venture capital. Stanford's business program has a whole semester devoted to studying how you identify and nurture breakthrough technologies. The weight of his words hit me like lightning. For months, my family had convinced me that I was a failed entrepreneur dabbling in investments without building anything substantial. But here was proof that my investment strategies had created billion-dollar companies and were being studied as models for transformative business building. Miss Mitchell, you need to understand what you've accomplished, David said, pulling out a business magazine. This month's Fortune featured you as one of the top 25 most influential investors under 40, though they couldn't get much information about you since you keep such a low profile. He reached into his folder one more time and pulled out a research report. Goldman Sachs published an analysis of your portfolio companies. Collectively, the businesses you've invested in and mentored are worth over $15 billion and employ more than 8,000 people. You haven't just been building companies, you've been building entire industries. Sitting in my simple home office looking at evidence of impact I'd never fully grasped, something fundamental shifted inside me. My family's narrative crumbled completely in that moment. I wasn't a failed entrepreneur who'd been rightfully disinherited. I was one of the most successful investors in Silicon Valley, creating value that dwarfed anything my family had ever accomplished. The woman they'd cut off from a $50 million inheritance had actually built an empire worth hundreds of millions while transforming entire sectors of the technology industry. David's visit ignited something that had been dormant for months. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with corporate documents spread across every surface, mapping out not just my investment returns, but the comprehensive ecosystem of companies I'd built, funded, and guided over the past 15 years. For the first time since my father's funeral, I wasn't dwelling on my family's rejection. I was documenting my actual business empire, the real scope of influence I wielded in the technology industry. I started reaching out to CEOs, founders, and portfolio company executives who had worked with me over the years. The conversations were revelatory. Michelle Rodriguez, CEO of Dataflow Analytics, told me that my strategic guidance had been instrumental in their acquisition by Microsoft for $3.8 billion. Jennifer, you didn't just provide capital, you helped us pivot our entire business model toward enterprise solutions. Your board-level insights shaped every major decision we made. The National Venture Capital Association sent me a detailed impact report showing how my investment methodology had influenced industry standards. My approach to supporting early-stage companies with intensive mentorship had been adopted by over 200 venture firms across the country. The data showed that companies using my framework had survival rates 400% higher than industry averages and generated 60% more jobs per dollar invested. But the most powerful validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Chang from Stanford's Graduate School of Business called to invite me to deliver their keynote address on entrepreneurial investing. "Jennifer, we've been studying your portfolio composition and value creation strategies for 2 years. Your ability to identify transformative technologies and scale them into industry-leading companies has become the gold standard for venture capital methodology." As I compiled this evidence, a clearer picture emerged. My family had interpreted my private investment approach as aimless entrepreneurship, but the reality was that I'd been building one of the most successful venture capital portfolios in Silicon Valley. My low public profile wasn't evidence of failure. It was proof that I understood the difference between building wealth and seeking recognition. I began organizing documents that revealed the true scope of my business influence. Corporate filings showing my ownership stakes in 47 different companies. Investment agreements listing me as lead investor in multiple unicorn startups. Board meeting minutes demonstrating my strategic role in major business decisions that had shaped entire market sectors. More importantly, I discovered that my influence extended far beyond individual company success. MIT's Entrepreneurship Center had created a fellowship program based on my mentorship methodology. Harvard Business Review had published 3 case studies analyzing my approach to technology investing. The Small Business Administration had consulted me on policies for supporting high-growth startups. I found correspondence from other major investors seeking my advice on market analysis and portfolio strategy. Sequoia Capital had requested my input on emerging technology trends. Andreessen Horowitz had asked me to co-lead investment rounds in companies where my expertise would be valuable. Goldman Sachs had invited me to join their technology advisory board. But the most significant discovery came when I researched my holdings in Novatech Solutions, the company where my brother Daniel worked. My venture capital firm had been accumulating shares through multiple investment rounds over the past 8 years. Between direct equity purchases, convertible debt positions, and proxy voting agreements, I controlled 60% of the company's outstanding shares. The numbers were staggering. My total portfolio was worth over $500 million, spread across investments that were generating both substantial returns and massive economic impact. I wasn't just a successful investor, I was one of the most influential people in the entire technology ecosystem, with the power to shape industry direction and determine the fate of major companies. The evidence was overwhelming. While my family had been measuring success through inherited wealth and corporate employment, I'd been creating new industries and building companies that would define the future economy. The failed entrepreneur they'd disinherited was actually controlling more business value than their entire family fortune represented, and doing it through companies that were transforming how the world used technology. The woman they'd cut off from a $50 million inheritance had built something worth 10 times that amount, while creating economic opportunities for thousands of people across multiple industries. The breakthrough I'd been searching for came from the most unexpected place: my father's private study. 3 months after the funeral, my cousin called to say that my father's house was being prepared for sale, and asked if I wanted to collect any personal items before everything was donated or discarded. I almost declined, but something drew me back to the room where I'd spent childhood hours listening to his business stories. In his mahogany desk, hidden behind decades of investment reports and corporate documents, I found a locked drawer I'd never noticed before. The key was taped inside his copy of The Intelligent Investor, with a note that read, "For Jennifer, the true innovator in the family." Inside were documents that completely stunned me. My father had been quietly tracking my business activities for years, somehow accessing corporate filings and investment records that revealed the true scope of my success. He had copies of SEC documents showing my ownership stakes in major companies. He'd saved documentation of my venture capital fund's performance metrics. He'd even kept press clippings from industry publications that praised my investment strategies. But the most shocking discovery was a thick folder labeled Jennifer's Real Achievements. Inside were printed emails, legal documents, and records that revealed my family had actually known much more about my success than they'd ever admitted, and had been actively working to suppress that knowledge. There was an email chain between my mother and Daniel from 8 months before my father's death. Jennifer's name keeps coming up in tech industry reports, and her investment firm is getting recognition we can't ignore. If she's actually as successful as these articles suggest, it makes our traditional business approach look outdated. We need to be careful about how we position her achievements within the family narrative. Another email, this one from Daniel to my Uncle Robert, was even more revealing. I did some research on Jennifer's portfolio companies after a colleague at Novatech mentioned her name in connection with major venture deals. She might actually control significant stakes in companies I thought were completely independent. Should we be concerned about how this affects family dynamics? But the most devastating find was a letter my mother had written to my father but apparently never sent. Henry, I know you're proud of Jennifer's unconventional success, but we're worried about the implications. If she's actually built the kind of wealth these reports suggest, it undermines everything we've taught Daniel about traditional career paths. How do we maintain family unity when one daughter has outperformed our entire family legacy through methods we don't understand? My father had also uncovered something I'd never known. My family had been actively discouraging business publications from featuring me in family profiles. Through his connections in Philadelphia's business community, he'd learned that my mother had been telling journalists that I preferred to, quote, to keep a low profile, and wasn't interested in publicity about my investment activities. At the bottom of the drawer was a letter from my father, written in his careful handwriting just 6 weeks before he died. My dearest Jennifer, if you're reading this, then they've convinced you that your success threatens the family rather than enhances it. But I've been watching your business empire grow with the same pride I felt watching you take your first steps. Your family measures success by inheritance and employment, but you've created wealth that exceeds anything the Mitchell name has ever represented. They're not ashamed of your failures. They're terrified of your success because it exposes the limitations of their own ambitions. I've seen the corporate filings. I know about Novatech. When the truth comes out, don't let them claim they always knew. Make them face what they refuse to acknowledge. You haven't just built companies, Jennifer. You've built the future. And sometimes the people who cling most tightly to the past are the ones who fear change the most. I sat in that quiet study, surrounded by evidence of my father's secret pride in my achievements, and finally understood why my inheritance had been contested. It wasn't about my failures. It was about their fear of my success. Armed with my father's evidence, I began digging deeper into my family's systematic campaign to hide my business success. What I discovered was more calculated and deliberate than I could have imagined. They hadn't just been concerned about my unconventional career path, they'd been actively working to suppress knowledge of my achievements, because those achievements threatened their entire worldview about wealth, success, and family hierarchy. I reached out to business contacts and industry colleagues, asking careful questions about what they'd heard regarding my family's view of my ventures. The responses revealed a disturbing pattern. Michael Torres from TechCrunch admitted he'd always wondered why my family never participated in feature stories about successful business dynasties. Jennifer, we approached her family multiple times about profiling the Mitchell legacy in technology investing. Your mother specifically requested that we focus on, quote, traditional business achievements, rather than venture capital activities. The pattern became clear. My family had been systematically avoiding any public association with my success while simultaneously promoting their narrative that I was an unstable entrepreneur who needed guidance. I contacted business publications that had tried to feature my investment work, asking if my family had ever been approached for comment. Sarah Mitchell from Forbes revealed something shocking. Jennifer, your brother Daniel was contacted last year when we were preparing our, quote, 40 under 40 feet investors list. He specifically asked us not to mention family connections, saying that your investment activities were, quote, too speculative to represent the Mitchell family's business philosophy. But the smoking gun came when I obtained corporate communications through a portfolio company CEO who had access to internal correspondence. My family had been making inquiries about my business activities through professional channels, not to support me but to gather information they could use to undermine my credibility. Daniel had contacted the compliance department at Novatech, claiming he needed to understand potential conflicts of interest related to, quote, family members with investment activities in the technology sector. He'd been trying to discover whether I had any ownership stakes in his own company, ostensibly for ethical disclosure purposes but actually to assess how much influence I might have over his career. More shocking still was the discovery that my mother had been quietly discouraging Philadelphia business leaders from investing in funds where I had advisory roles. Through a contact at Liberty Partners, I learned that my mother had been telling potential investors that I was still finding my footing in the business world, and that my investment strategies were too aggressive for conservative portfolios. The most devastating revelation came from an unlikely source, Novatech's own board meeting minutes, which I accessed through my controlling ownership position. Daniel had been actively lobbying against potential technology investments that might compete with companies in my portfolio, claiming he had insider knowledge about unstable venture capital activities in the sector. My uncle Robert had been even more systematic in his efforts to contain my influence. He'd contacted several Ivy League business schools where I'd been invited to speak, suggesting that my experimental investment approaches might not provide the best guidance for students seeking traditional career paths. The final piece of evidence came from the most unexpected source, my family's own financial advisor, who inadvertently revealed their coordinated strategy during a casual conversation with a mutual contact. They'd been consulting with wealth management experts about how to fort family narrative away from risky entrepreneurship and toward proven wealth preservation strategies. The pattern was unmistakable. My family hadn't just been dismissing my achievements, they'd been actively working to prevent those achievements from becoming widely known, because my success exposed the limitations of their own traditional approach to business and wealth building. They'd systematically undermined my professional reputation to protect their belief system about how success should be measured and achieved. I realized that my father's final letter had been right. The truth about my ownership of Novatech would make my family's conspiracy impossible to maintain, and when it came out, they would have to face exactly how much they'd underestimated the daughter they'd tried to erase. The call came on a crisp October morning while I was reviewing board meeting agendas in my home office. Marcus Thompson from Novatech Solutions was on the line, his voice carrying the excitement of someone delivering transformative news. "Jennifer, the board has approved the IPO timeline. We're going public in 6 months, and the preliminary valuation is $12 billion. As our majority shareholder, this represents the largest individual stake in any technology IPO this year." I sat in stunned silence for a moment, then managed to respond. "Marcus, that's incredible news. I'm proud of what the team has accomplished." "Jennifer, this isn't just about valuation. Novatech's public offering is being called the most significant technology IPO since Facebook. Your strategic guidance and patient capital investment have created one of the most valuable companies in the software industry." The irony was overwhelming. While my family had been disinheriting me for failed business ventures, I'd been quietly building ownership in what would become one of the most successful public companies of the decade. The news broke the next day when Novatech's IPO filing was submitted to the SEC. The mandatory disclosure documents revealed the company's ownership structure, and my name appeared as the controlling shareholder with 60.3% of all outstanding shares. Headlines in the Wall Street Journal and Financial Times read, "Mystery investor revealed as Novatech majority owner, and Jennifer Mitchell controls $7.2 billion stake in software giant." My phone exploded with calls from financial journalists, investment analysts, and technology executives wanting to discuss my investment strategy and the company's prospects. But the calls I was most curious about still hadn't come. My family remained completely silent. The real moment of vindication came exactly 7 months after my father's funeral. My family had scheduled a meeting with their estate attorney to finalize the inheritance reallocation, unaware that the meeting would coincide with Novatech's public revelation of their ownership structure. I arrived at the law offices of Morrison & Associates to find my entire family seated around the conference table where they'd originally stripped me of my inheritance. But now Marcus Thompson, Novatech's CEO, was standing at the head of the table with several company executives, having been invited to discuss Daniel's potential promotion to executive vice president. My mother, Daniel, and Uncle Robert looked confused about why a business meeting was happening during their legal appointment, but James Morrison had requested the overlap to address what he called relevant conflicts of interest. Marcus Thompson stepped forward with a formal smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we discuss Mr. Daniel Mitchell's advancement opportunities at Novatech, I need to introduce someone who will have significant input on all senior leadership decisions. He gestured toward me as I entered the conference room. "I'd like you to meet Jennifer Mitchell, the majority shareholder and controlling owner of Novatech Solutions. She owns 60.3% of our company, which means she effectively controls the organization where Daniel works." The silence in the room was deafening. Daniel's face went completely white as the full implications of Marcus's words hit him. My mother looked like she might faint. Uncle Robert stared at me with an expression of absolute shock. "Ms. Jennifer Mitchell," Marcus continued, "has been our primary investor for 8 years and serves as chairman of our board of directors. Her strategic vision has been instrumental in building Novatech into the $12 billion company we are today." James Morrison looked directly at my family. "I believe this revelation has significant implications for your inheritance discussions. The daughter you disinherited for failed business ventures now controls a company worth more than 10 times your father's entire estate." For the first time in my life, my family had no words. The woman they'd called a failure was now Daniel's boss, and his entire career was literally in my hands. 2 years later, I stood before the Forbes Global Technology Summit, delivering the opening keynote on patient capital and transformational leadership to an audience of 3,000 entrepreneurs, investors, and technology executives from around the world. As the founder and managing partner of Mitchell Ventures, now one of the most successful venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, I was sharing strategies that had created over $50 billion in cumulative company value across my portfolio. The same investment philosophy my family had dismissed as financial irresponsibility was now being studied by business schools and implemented by investment firms globally. The transformation hadn't just been professional, it had been profoundly personal. The woman who had once questioned her worth after being disinherited was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true success comes not from inherited wealth or family approval, but from creating value that transcends individual achievement and builds lasting economic opportunity for entire industries. My business empire had grown beyond what even I had initially envisioned. Novatech's successful IPO had generated over $7 billion in personal wealth, which I'd reinvested into 43 additional technology companies. My portfolio now included some of the most innovative firms in artificial intelligence, renewable energy, and biotechnology. The companies I'd funded employed over 25,000 people across 6 countries and had generated breakthrough technologies that were reshaping how humans interact with digital systems. The numbers were staggering. Mitchell Ventures controlled over $15 billion in assets under management, had achieved an average annual return of 340% across all investments, and had been recognized by Harvard Business Review as the most successful technology investment firm of the past decade. We'd been featured in case studies at Stanford, Wharton, and MIT as an example of how strategic patience and intensive mentorship could create sustainable technology ecosystems. My family had eventually reached out, of course. It started with formal apologies after Novatech's IPO made my success impossible to ignore, then awkward invitations to family gatherings, where they could now proudly introduce me as Jennifer, who owns several billion-dollar companies. They wanted to reconcile, to heal the family wounds, and perhaps benefit from my newfound prominence in the technology industry. I met with them once, in the boardroom of Mitchell Ventures headquarters in Palo Alto. They came prepared with elaborate explanations and revised family narratives. My mother talked about how she'd always believed in my innovative spirit, but had been concerned about protecting me from premature pressure. Daniel claimed he'd always known I was building something significant, but had been respecting my need for privacy during the development phase. I listened politely, then shared something they didn't expect. I'd established the Henry Mitchell Foundation for Entrepreneurial Innovation, named after my father. The foundation provided seed funding for first-generation entrepreneurs, created mentorship programs connecting experienced investors with emerging business leaders, and funded technology education initiatives in underserved communities. We'd already disbursed $100 million in grants and had partnered with 20 universities to provide free entrepreneurship education. "This is my real legacy," I told them. Not just building successful companies, but proving that patient capital and strategic mentorship can create sustainable innovation ecosystems that benefit entire societies. Dad understood that wealth should create opportunity, not just preserve status. I didn't cut them off completely, but I didn't pretend that their sudden pride meant anything either. They'd revealed their true values when they thought I was powerless, and that knowledge had freed me from needing their validation or approval. The sweetest vindication came from an unexpected source. Daniel, after successfully growing under my leadership at Novatech, had launched his own technology startup with seed funding from Mitchell Ventures. "Jennifer," he told me during a family dinner, "I realize now that I never understood the difference between earning success and inheriting it. You built something from nothing while I was just following a predetermined path." My office walls now displayed photos from technology conferences around the world, awards from innovation organizations, and thank you letters from entrepreneurs whose companies had been transformed through our investment and mentorship programs. But the centerpiece was still my father's letter, framed next to a photo of us together when I was 10 years old, both of us holding a computer manual he'd bought to teach me about emerging technologies. The woman who had been disinherited for failed business ventures had become someone who now controlled more wealth than her family's entire generational fortune while creating economic opportunities for thousands of entrepreneurs worldwide. And the best part? I'd done it by staying true to my vision and refusing to let anyone else define the limits of what innovation could achieve. My name is Jennifer Mitchell, and I am exactly who I was always meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.